This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and today is January 31st, 2023. It's the feast day of St. John Bosco, who was a favorite saint of mine who's been very inspiring to me in my work in education. And so I wish you all a happy feast of St. John Bosco, and pray for his intercession that we may have his zeal and concern for children. And I think that this is a good segue into the topic of today's discussion. Earlier this week, a friend asked if I would consider doing a talk on the topic of unwanted pregnancies or an unexpected teen pregnancy in a family. And since we spend a lot of time talking about parenting and all of the different challenges of parenting, I'd like to take up this topic and think through it a bit, because as a father, let me speak as a father in this situation. As a father, I can understand the stress and sorrow and maybe anger that a man would feel to learn that either a son or a daughter was involved in an unexpected, unplanned, maybe unwanted pregnancy, and just how difficult a situation that would be to handle. I can understand how traumatic it would be for a mother who had to learn of such a situation, and all of that initial emotional, human, natural responding that we would make before we had a chance to catch our breath and think and come up with a plan for what the right thing to do really is, what the right thing to think, what the right thing to feel. And remember, as human beings, what our responsibility is not to react to things, because our reactions, our emotions, our passions, they're all natural, and they're all disordered because they're not intended to exist by themselves. They're all intended to be governed by reason. So when God put the different passions in us, He put them in us to serve their own purpose, and they're sort of wild by themselves. But He didn't intend for them to operate by themselves, but to always be subject to reason. And so that initial reaction is all passion and isn't responsible. It isn't right. It isn't moral. Certainly isn't in any way spiritual or devout. It's just natural and raw and human. And so there's going to be that initial reaction, and it's almost impossible to prevent or hold back that initial reaction. But then after those irrational human passions are expressed or vented, everyone calms down and has time to think, and discussion can begin to figure out what in the world to do. It's a life-changing situation. So where do we begin with all this? And again, we've got to consider this from the perspective of well, first of all, we've got to consider whether it's an unwanted or unexpected pregnancy, and the person involved is a female or a male, because those two situations are different. And then we have to think of the parents, different parents on both sides, parents of the female, parents of the male. And the first thing I would say is I strongly discourage anyone in these situations to ever jump to the conclusion that parents are irresponsible, that parents are negligent, that they weren't doing their job, and so on. It's really, as we'll see as we open this up, it's really common and cruel to immediately suspect that a situation like this takes place or arises because the parents are unfaithful or irresponsible or disobedient to God's will, and so on. Remember that every single human being has a will, and it's obvious that children disobey their parents. Children disobey their parents. Children are clearly taught what to do. Parents do what is in their power and reasonable to restrain their children from doing bad things, but often the children scheme and work to get around their parents or away from their parents, and they do bad things that they have been soundly instructed in, clearly warned of, and even physically restrained from as an act of their own will. And there's nothing that their parents, within reason, can possibly do to prevent such an event from taking place. So please don't jump to the conclusion that it's the parents' fault. That's a really cruel accusation to make, and unless there is very clear demonstrative evidence that such is the case, that a parent actually was neglectful or didn't care or even facilitated the situation, we should never blame the actions of older children on parents, because it's most likely that the children knew perfectly well that they shouldn't be doing what they were doing, that the parents had warned them 1,000 times about doing it, and they chose to disobey for any number of reasons, and they got into the situation that they're in because of their own will. So let's avoid judging parents in these situations. Plus, parents, once these situations are revealed, parents aren't simply faced with a momentary reaction to make or a decision to make. Parents are faced with a life-changing event, because this child that's been conceived is their grandchild. This is a part of the family. The family's changing in a situation like this, and the parents have to take into consideration what their responsibilities are, what the best thing to do is in that situation, and there's going to be a lot of peer pressure and shame to deal with, that they have to have the guts and the toughness of mind to overcome and do what's right. And to see parents do that is beautiful. And again, rather than blame parents for some kind of fault, what we normally see is just how good the parents actually are, that even in such a situation, they're still loving, they're still concerned about God's will and doing what pleases God, even though they could put their foot down, humanly speaking, and say, this is none of my business, I want nothing to do with this, and so on. So often the parents' true character is revealed in these situations, and we see just how good parents they are. So anyway, let's try to find some principles. We don't just want to share opinions. That's useless. And what I try to do is reflect on these controversial situations and establish some principles that can allow us to come out of these reflections with some peace of mind and confidence that we know what we should do, so that we can move forward and do the right thing. Before I even get into any more of this, I just want to say that one of the greatest problems that Christians have in this generation is they learn the Christian faith by reading ancient scriptures. They learn the Christian faith by reading historical biographies. They learn the Christian faith by watching movies. They learn the Christian faith usually through some historical source. And they live in a society, they live in a generation, they live in a culture that is very, very different from the society that provides the context for the sources of the books they read, the stories they read, when they're reading the scriptures or church history or saint biographies and so on. Our society is very, very different than those societies. Morally, our society is very, very inferior to those societies for a number of objective reasons. This isn't my opinion. I can explain objective reasons why in these kinds of moral situations with children and young adults, the culture and the circumstances in which we live in this generation are completely unlike circumstances that existed at different historical periods of time, and this has very significant effects on our family lives, as you probably know. First of all, we live in a capitalistic society where everyone's under financial pressure, and this is the first challenge in parenting. I always say this to my wife, that one of the challenges of parenting as an American parent is that we live in a capitalistic society where we're all forced to compete in a constantly changing economy, and none of us can take a break. We have to work, we have to think, we have to constantly be improving ourselves and looking ahead, not with a godless anxiety, but with a responsibility, a responsible solicitousness about the future, because the markets change, things move, competitors arise, and the work that we do has to constantly be adapting to these changes. So as parents, we're not free to sit around and plan out fairy tale lives for our children. We're not free to handle every single situation in family life in the best way possible, because we have to work to even provide for our families the basic needs of life. And this is challenging enough as it is. So we've got this constant pressure and challenge, this constant busyness that is a necessary part of life in our society. And therefore, we're often, just think about it, it's often dad's learning about something that happened during the day when he gets home from work. He wasn't there with the kids. He was at work. He has to work. The kids won't even have food, clothing, or housing, or education if dad doesn't work. Sometimes even the mother is working, and they're finding out things. They're getting a phone call at work telling them that a child was in a fight at school, or a child didn't show up for class, or something bad happened, or there was a car accident, or some other problem. Very, very rarely is there a time when parents have the opportunity to spend their days with their children. And even if they do, they're still working. I have that privilege in being self-employed and working from a home office. I'm always home with my children. My children are not with me in the office. They're not with me where I'm working. But I tend to know what's going on within minutes. If any of my children are acting badly or fooling around, I know within minutes. I can control things. I can check in on things. That's a privilege that I thank God for. But most parents are busy working. Dad could be traveling for business. He may not even be around, and problems may need to be dealt with. Parents may be away for different things. Kids be unfortunately left unsupervised for a time because of situations the parents didn't choose but are stuck dealing with. And we can judge all of these things with a perfectionist, hypocritical spirit, but it's simply inevitable in many cases. It's just how our society operates. And there's just so many chances and circumstances for kids to get into trouble, that it's nearly impossible to prevent a child who wants to do bad from doing bad. And I tell my children this all the time. I tell my children, look, if you want to sin, if you want to be bad, no one's going to be able to stop you. And I also warn my children that when they're doing bad things, that they shouldn't think they're getting away with something. They're simply making bad decisions to do things that they've been warned not to do. And beyond that, beyond the normal disciplinary actions of parents within their normal control and their normal availability, really, there's only so much parents can reasonably do. And at some point, the children, especially as they get into teenage years, they have to realize that it's time for them to make their own decisions, and if they choose to make bad decisions, they're going to suffer the consequences of those decisions. The parents can teach, the parents can model right behavior, the parents can warn them of consequences of bad behavior. The parents can do everything within their power reasonably to prevent bad situations from happening. But when all is said and done, the will of the individual child is going to be sought out. And if it's bad, if the child has an evil will and wants to do bad, that child's going to get into trouble. And there really isn't anything that the parents are going to be able to do about it. If the child wants to do evil, he's going to do it. And that leaves the parents to deal with the consequences. Because even though they tell the children all through their lives, they tell them, look, if you make choices to do bad things, you're going to pay the consequences. That's true. But at the same time, those consequences indirectly affect the parents, and the parents are then left with decisions to make, not to spite themselves or to inflict even worse, consequences on their children, but to try to make the best of the situation. And that's really what I'd like to talk about, making the best of a bad situation. That's the real challenge. And I think Christians tend to do a bad job of that today, because there's this arrogant attitude that throwing your kids out of the house is some kind of heroic virtue, when in fact it's selfish. It's selfish because it sort of puts the problem out of sight and therefore pretends that it's out of mind. But ultimately, the parents' concern should be for the welfare of the child, and not just the physical welfare, but the long-term spiritual welfare of the child. And if that is what the parents concerned with, if the parents really concerned with the child's welfare, then how does throwing the kid out of the house or pushing the kid out so the kid now is immersed with other influences that are not necessary, how does that help the child or help the situation at all? It's an easy, lazy, irresponsible cop-out. And so we've got to reflect on the situation and ask, how can we make the best of these situations? How can we glorify God by responding to difficult circumstances in the best way possible? That's really what marks a saint. That's what marks a virtuous man and a loving parent. And we have to also remember that our response to a bad situation in our children's lives may be an opportunity, or I shouldn't even say maybe, is an opportunity to model the true power of the Christian faith in a way that may have the greatest impact in our children's lives. It may be the opportunity to provide the strongest and most powerful witness to the truth of Christianity that our children will ever experience. And it may be the thing that even far beyond all of the talks and lessons and warnings as parents, the response that we make to an unfortunate situation that afflicts us personally may be the truest and most powerful witness to the Christian faith that we ever have the opportunity to make. And we have to be very careful that we don't waste it, especially if we're selfish and lazy and are looking for an easy way out of a difficult problem. Just think what that testifies to. So we have to ask, how can we respond to such a situation in the best way possible? That's the challenge. And really, to be honest, I don't think that the problem in these situations, for honest parents, for loving parents, for good parents, the problem isn't dealing with the problem. The problem isn't dealing with the bad situation. We already know in most cases what we're going to need to do because we always do it. We're always the ones who fill in the gap. That's what Christians do. We're always the ones who solve the problems. We're always the one who go the extra mile. We're always the ones who give and lay down our lives for others, because that's what Christians do, and we already know what we're going to have to do. But the danger, I think, for Christians is not so much thinking about our children and what needs to be done, but it's pressure of what other people are going to think. And it's frustrating for us, it's frustrating for Christians, because as a Christian parent, you may work and sacrifice and plan and do everything that you can do for years and years and years, and in the end, not end up with the reward of this sort of exemplary, award-winning, loving, grateful, parent-praising child, but you may end up with an embarrassing situation. And you may have the experience that Job had in the book of Job in the Bible, where he said, "What I feared has come upon me." And what's unfortunate about this is that the parents have often done everything that they should have done to prevent themselves from having to go through such a situation, and yet, nevertheless, here they are, dealing with this reality that what they feared has come upon them. And it's undeserved. It may be unexpected, but what's most difficult about it is that it's undeserved. And therefore, the suspicions, the accusations, and so on that other people will make because they're just evil, those experiences, I think parents fear more than the actual problem, which is dealing with this unplanned, unwanted, unexpected, whatever you want to call it, pregnancy. And so I encourage parents that if you ever do have to deal with a situation like this or something else, make sure that it's not a fear just of what other people think that's influencing your decisions. You have to love your children and mind your own business. People who meddle in your business, people who are judging, people who are looking into your family life to criticize, they're losers, and you need to ignore those people. Your responsibility is to your family, not to those people. And those people will always be present. Those idle, meddlesome gossips with all their suspicions and hypocrisy, because they ignore all their own problems and they try to magnify yours, because that's how they make themselves look good. In their smallness, they try to make others look smaller. And they're always going to be there, and they're going to test your humility. And you need to overcome that test. And be humble, focus on your family, mind your own business, and just ignore them, because it doesn't matter what anyone says. It doesn't matter. So let's dig into this a bit. I wanted to get that out first because, we have to stop blaming parents unjustly. Parents have to stop blaming themselves unjustly. And another thing I should warn of is parents have to stop looking at each other, blaming each other unjustly. That's ugly, and it It just isn't true. How many times do I see and hear a Christian mother blaming her husband for some problem in the family because he was working? That's his job. That's what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to provide for the family. He's not some kind of worldly wretch, some kind of neglectful, deadbeat dad because he went to work every day. That's what he's supposed to do. He has to provide for the family. He bears a great deal of stress dealing with that responsibility of providing for the family. Of course, he wasn't at family prayer every day. He was working. Of course, he may have been, stressed out and distracted, or he might have placed a great emphasis on worldly concerns when the kids were growing up. That's because he's the provider for a family living in this competitive environment, trying to encourage his kids to prepare. And he doesn't necessarily have spiritual concerns in the forefront of his mind because he knows that a life that's not provided for is very difficult. It's very difficult, I should say, to live a spiritually focused life when you don't have the bills paid. There is a certain level of responsibility. Aristotle explains this in the Ethics, that there is a dependence of religion and virtue on material resources. Our needs have to be provided for. And so many times the fathers are occupied with these things, and the wives who are freed from those concerns and enjoy a more focused religious life as housewives. They often blame their husbands for being worldly, and it's just an unjust accusation. And in these difficult times, those accusations and that fighting, that can be very painful. And you've got to be very careful in how you respond. Because when we say nasty things, even if later on we apologize, those things are still there. They never go away. So be careful. Be careful with this blame game. It's another part of this trial that we have to overcome and try to deal with rightly. So let's just think about this with those things out of the way. I mentioned before that our society is very different than other societies. And these kids, I think that we look at our children with medieval or Victorian expectations, while our children actually live in a society that doesn't provide for the fulfillment of those expectations. I think our expectations, what we desire from our children, doesn't agree with what we put into our children, or what our children actually receive from us and live in. And it's not our fault. It's a different society. Like I said, we learn about the Christian life, we learn about family life often by looking backwards into history. And we don't consider carefully the context of the lives we read and the stories we read and the movies we watch, and we bring those fruits of other generations and cultures and societies, we bring a desire for those fruits into our culture, ignoring the fact that none of the sources that were in place in those historic times are present in our time. And our children are often asked to make bricks with no straw, to use a biblical image. I remember learning this because there was a time when I was having an argument with my daughter. And my daughter said to me in the midst of this argument, she said something like, We're not what you think we are. And she was referring to our family. And she was a teenager, and it was an argument. I'm not going to get into the details, but we were having an argument, and she said, We're not who you think we are. Because I was explaining to her what I expected from her in terms of behavior, what I expected from her in terms of culture, and so on. And I have a certain certain opinion or idea about the culture and life that our family lives, the opportunities we have, the resources we have, and so on. Because I compare my life situation to the life that I grew up in. I grew up in a family that wasn't even Christian. I grew up in a family where the kids just went to public school, where nobody went to church, where we just sat around the house idle, where the TV was always on, where there could be dirty movies on TV in the living room, in the middle of the house at 9 o'clock at night. That was the culture I grew up in. My parents didn't have much money. We had no culture. All of our friends and relatives were unbelievers. I grew up in that culture, no education, no culture, no religion, and so on. And when I think about my family life today, I compare my life to the life that I grew up in, and I imagine that I'm living in a paradise, in a fantasy land. And it's hard for me to comprehend, and I believe this is true of many Christian families. It's hard for us Christians, especially when we're converts, it's hard for us to understand that as rich as we feel our life is, as abundantly as we feel that we're living as Christians, the culture and the resources available to us are nothing remotely close to those that were enjoyed by Christian families in other historical periods, in other societies, and so on. We think of ourselves far more highly than we ought, because in our minds we compare the richness of our present life in God's grace, surrounded with sacred scripture, the writings of the saints, Catholic devotional resources, the church, the sacraments, on and on. We think of all of these riches that we're immersed in, and we're so grateful and we're so conscious of these things. And we just feel that we're overflowing. And our children, having not been raised in the culture that we were raised in, but being raised in a home where Christian conduct and life is expected, and the riches of the Christian life are not appreciated in the same way that we appreciate them, it's hard for us to understand that our Catholic children don't look at life as Catholics the same way that we do as converts. It's very hard for us to be self-aware in this way. It's very hard for us to realize that the goggles that we're wearing of our past experience are not the goggles that our children are wearing. Things are very different. Think about what Jesus said in the gospel when he said, those who are forgiven much love much. Those who are forgiven much love much. Those of us who are converts, most of us came into the Christian faith out of sinful, shameful pasts. And we're very conscious of God's grace, and we're very thankful. We love God because He first loved us, and we experienced that feeling of being loved while we were yet sinners. We know that feeling. We look back on the sins of our youth or the sins of our past, because maybe we weren't youth when we converted. We look back on our sins and we justify them because of the environment that we grew up in, or the circumstances that we lived in, or the fact that we were surrounded with temptations. We justify the things we did, and we feel that they weren't really a big deal because, what else could we do? We were unbelievers. That's why converts are often comfortable confessing their sins and talking about their sins, because they can make an excuse for them. They can say, I wasn't even a Christian back then. And they can play the hypocrite now and act like, I would never do that now. But back when I was a a pagan, I used to do. So it's easy for converts to often talk about their past sins because they can blame it on being unbelievers or being raised in an unbelieving family and so on. Whereas children raised in a Catholic home, they're expected to live like converted Christians, even though they don't have that experience. They don't have the same experience of God's grace. They don't have the same feelings of God's unconditional love and goodness, because they grew up in a home where Christianity was the norm and good behavior was expected. And we think, as parents, we think that our kids are just going to pick up where we left off and move forward. And our expectations are not reasonable. They take our conversion for granted. They take our experiences of the world for granted. For example, I grew up as a public school kid, immersed in the world. I had hundreds of friends, played sports, did every bad thing I wanted to do, went to parties, goofed around, experienced everything the world has to offer. And when I was 18 years old, I was ready to move on. I had seen it all, and I was ready to do something else. Kids being raised in a Christian family where those experiences are not had, they're often dramatized and hyped up by advertising and by television and movies and all of this stuff. And they don't get to experience it, so they sort of sit like kids looking through the store window at these gifts. And they imagine what they must be like. They imagine what it's like, and they don't actually experience it. Whereas those of us who are converts, we already had those toys, and we know that they're junk. They broke after a few times of playing with them. The batteries went out. It's a pain in the neck to get batteries all the time. It's not as fun as it looks, and we're not interested anymore. But our kids look at it like kids looking through store windows. And the world does everything that it can to puff these things up, to make them desirable. And our kids, the situation they're in is almost impossible for them to avoid going in the opposite direction that we've gone, and basically voluntarily going to experience the world because they simply don't trust us that it's not worth having. They look at us as Christians and they really don't understand that we're converted from unbelievers. They didn't know us when we were unbelievers. They didn't know us when we were kids. They know us as, boring, orderly, routine Catholics, and they don't think we understand the world, and they want to experience it for themselves. And that's the most grievous thing about being a parent, is saying, I climbed and scratched and clawed to get to this position, and I always hoped that you would just take this as your starting point and go forward, and now here you are. You want to go backwards? That's one of the most frustrating things about Christian parenting, and most Christian parents misread this thinking in their children. They misread it. They assume that this is a sign that all is lost. They read it as a sign that our children are, having tasted, are rejecting the faith, and they're leaving, and they're going to be unbelievers. And that's really not what's happening. Our children are simply testing the world in the same way that we got to test it, because they don't feel confident that it's bad and God alone is good. And when they seek to test it, we get angry and frustrated at them, and we're acting hypocritically because we did the same thing. Remember, we may have been unbelievers as kids, but there were people telling us, don't do this, don't do that, stay away from that, and we did it anyway. It's not like we were encouraged to do evil all the time. And our kids, being inexperienced, not understanding what's truly good, but being deceived by all kinds of different influences and appearances, they're going to pursue things that they perceive to be good and don't understand. And when they do that, it's not this apostasy from the faith, which parents blow up into, total spiritual ruin. It's simply a natural interest in things that appear to be desirable. And we have to have confidence that our children are going to learn the hard way, unfortunately. We try to prevent them from learning this the hard way, but they're going to learn that these things are not what they appear to be. And when they learn that lesson, they'll be in a better position. They'll be able to think about it. They'll lose a great deal. It'll be like the prodigal son experience. They're going to have to suffer the consequences. But what we have to think about is the situation that develops after that experience is had. The situation that develops when the prodigal is done sinning. When the prodigal has danced with all the girls, experienced all the pleasure, and is left with all of the expenses. We have to think about that condition. And this prodigal period, or this, what the Amish people call the Rumspringa, where the kids inevitably test the world, as it were, we have to understand that period is necessary. By God's grace, it's not necessary, because God can give grace to a child to lead them away from any such interest or curiosity or deception. But for most kids, it's normally going to happen that they're going to disobey their parents, hang a left-hand turn at young adulthood, and get into all kinds of trouble. They're going to learn firsthand, by experience, the truth of what their Christian parents explained to them. They're going to pay the costs of these things that appeared to be desirable, but are found to be deceptions. And after that experience is had, they're going to be in a different frame of mind. And we all experience this as we mature. They're going to realize that what their parents told them was true. They're going to admit that they didn't trust their parents. They're going to admit that they made stupid decisions. And they're going to have to pay the price. And that's going to leave them more sober in life and also more trusting of the people who told them so. They're going to come out of it in a better frame of mind. Now, as I explain this, you may be saying to yourself, that's not necessarily true. They could actually end up killing themselves. They could end up as drug addicts. They could end up committing suicide. It could all turn out for the worst. Yeah, but you're not considering God in all of this and realizing that this is quite normal. Now, when we hear stories about kids committing suicide and things like that, there's usually more to the story. And I'd like to warn parents, and again, I'm not blaming parents, so don't take this in the wrong way, but if a kid gets himself into trouble, and when he makes a bad decision, receives nothing but anger and rejection from his parents, where does that kid have to turn? His situation is just going to get worse. I talked about this before. He's going to be driven further into the darkness. If he's hanging around with a group of kids that are no good for him, or a group of friends as young adults, and these people are no good for him, shunning him from the family only pushes him more completely into the influence of those people. And that's why I would argue that the Christian response to this disobedience of kids that leads them into all kinds of problems requires a Christian response and not a carnal, passionate, natural response. Because when our kids enter into those bad situations, they're actually in a better place. They're in a better place than they were as kids in the sense that they've had the chance to taste the world, and they know now that it's not sweet. And as far as leading them with a long-term, lifelong goal of leading them to eternal life, we find them, after these bad experiences, in a better place. And we have to love them in that place. It's going to be ugly. It's going to be embarrassing. You're going to have the gossips sticking their nose into your family business and spreading the gossip in all those different circles that they run in. And you just have to ignore that and love your family. Because when you're older, it's going to be you and your kids. It's going to be your family together. All of these busybodies will be like the chaff. They'll all be gone. And your family will be left. And you have to learn to commit to your family members. And think long term. But even when they make bad decisions and they get themselves into trouble, and my kids have gotten themselves into so many difficult troubles, we can look at that, we can shake our heads, we can be frustrated, we can be angry, but we have to ask, what's the best response from Christian dad? What's the best response from Christian mom? And we have to do it thinking not even about our kids, but thinking about Christ. What's the best response as Christ's followers for the glory of Christ? What's the best response? And this is the life that Jesus taught us, and our religion is symbolized by God on a cross. And so when we find ourselves in these situations, it's nothing but a cross for us to bear. It's an opportunity for us to understand what Christ was willing to do for us. And it's an opportunity for us to enter into that experience of being an imitator of Christ, being a savior of the world on a smaller scale, on the scale of our own family. One image that my wife and I like to use is we like to think of ourselves as absorbing the sin. Because we can do that, because we're Christians. Our roots are planted in streams of never-ending water. We go from grace to grace, we go from strength to strength because of the consolation that God supplies for us. We can handle these things. Our children who are weak, they can't necessarily handle these things, but we can. And we have the opportunity to enter into these unfortunate situations and be the saviors of those situations. And show our children what exactly the gospel really is about. We can show them in an earthly way, in an isolated way, what the gospel is really talking about, what Christ really did for us. And we give our children the opportunity to see what it feels like to be loved when they're not lovable, to receive love and patience and help from their parents when they know that they've let their parents down and deserve nothing but punishment and hatred and anger. Our children will expect that passionate response, and yet, by God's grace, they'll find something different. They'll find something that they never could have imagined, that they can't do themselves, that they would not do in that situation if they were in it. And they'll have a chance to experience the grace of God. And it's that opportunity, like I said, can be the most significant, the most influential moment in their lives as far as evangelization is concerned. And so we've got to prepare for these things because they can come unexpectedly. If you choose to give birth to a child, you sign up for a ride through a dark tunnel because you have no idea what's coming down the road, and you've got to be prepared for it. So we find ourselves in this kind of a situation, and as the parents, as Christian parents, our only concern is what can we do that will glorify God and will lead every person involved in this situation to eternal life. That's the only right response. That includes the two people involved in the pregnancy. That includes the child that's produced as a result of the pregnancy. That includes our own family members. And it includes all of the meddlesome, nosy gossips because they get a chance to see what real Christians look like because they're not real Christians. They're not acting like real Christians. They get a chance to see what real virtue looks like, what real patience looks like, what real love looks like, what real humility looks like, what real faith looks like. We get a chance to evangelize everyone around that situation by how we respond to it. And I think the answer to this is really pretty easy, how we should respond. We need to look at the crucifix and realize that the situation we find ourselves in is a cross to be borne, an opportunity to gain eternal life. Jesus told us that we need to take up our crosses. It's an opportunity for us to save our souls by responding rightly, by the grace of God, and not by our own human passions or the pressure of people around us, but to respond with grace and with wisdom and with faith that overcomes all of the world. Imagine behind all of this sin, behind all of these unwanted circumstances, behind all of this, it stands the devil and evil spirits and all of the evil people of the world. Keep them in mind and think of how to respond to this situation. Seeing your daughter or your son as standing between you and them. That the child is not necessarily the enemy, but there are darker enemies, far more evil enemies that actually encouraged the children in this, tempted them into this, led them into this, pushed them into this, deceived them into this. Think of those enemies and respond in a way that thwarts their efforts and condemns them for their evil. If you think about things rightly, it makes the response much easier. And this is also where the grace of marriage comes in, because being able to deal with a situation like this with the help of your spouse is very comforting. And I think that this is one of the graces that marriage does provide, is the ability for couples who are united by the sacrament of matrimony to actually deal with these evils that arise in family life and overcome them with love together and overcome evil with good and bring good results out of them. So there's going to be a million practical issues that have to be dealt with. What's going to be done? Obviously, we're not aborting children because they're unexpected or unintended. We're not going to put pressure on our kids to go down that route. You can see how that happens. The pressure can come from Christian parents that ultimately leads a kid to get an abortion because they say, oh, I can't even imagine how my dad will react. He's going to kill me, and be really sincerely terrified of a parent's response, and in light of that choose to then pursue an abortion. We want to make sure that that's not our children's response in that situation. We want to make sure that our children know in such a situation that the first thing they should do is talk to us. And we should be the kind of parents who, hearing bad news like that, are able to handle it and check our own passions and respond soberly and responsibly and reasonably. The consequences are not going to be avoided. And remember, too, that beyond these consequences, the decisions that our children make, remember there's always another fence outside of parental controls. There's another source of discipline in our children's lives that we may run into, and it's the fence of law enforcement and the law. Our children, when children disobey their parents during childhood, it's often with things that really are not the concern of the state or law enforcement, police or courts. If one of my sons is playing outside and throws a rock and breaks the living room window, I can get upset and punish the kid and find a way to replace the window and make him pay for it, but I'm not going to call the police on my 9-year-old son. The family absorbs a lot of those childhood evils, but when children enter into adulthood, the things that they do often have legal implications and legal consequences. And the power of the state assists us as parents and provides another source of discipline and control and warning to our children when they choose not to obey. The state is sort of a fence on the other side of the field, as it were. And our children may run into that fence and learn the hard way that the stuff that we tell them is no joke. You can tell the kids, when you get your license, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to speed, make sure you have your seatbelt on, make sure you follow the laws, don't do anything stupid while you're in your car. Well, that kid can go hop in that car and drive away, and he's on his own. But thanks be to God, there are police officers on the roads that are going to pull that kid over, give him a $200 ticket, send him to court, whatever the consequences may be. And the kids are going to learn that when you disobey mom and dad, there are consequences out here. We're not in the front yard anymore. The stuff that you do now affects other people and transgresses laws, and the cops come down on you and teach you a lesson. So we're going to have those experiences. We've had them in our family. We've had kids getting tickets and, thinking that they were cool out by themselves in a car, come home with a multi-$100 ticket and a court date, and learn the hard way that this isn't a joke. The things that your parents teach you are real. These problems are real, and your opinion about them as a kid is not real. And the police are going to teach you the hard way that your ideas aren't allowed around here. So when our children, get into these situations, we've got to realize that there are legal consequences. If a son gets involved in a pregnancy, he's responsible to now provide for that child and for this girl. He's got to find a way to provide, and we may need to help with that, as inconvenient as it is. We may need to help with that because that's our son's responsibility. And he's going to bear that responsibility. That responsibility may have a negative impact on his plans for his life. He may have to learn a hard lesson. And again, we need to look at that situation as parents and say, what's the best response, because we don't necessarily want to punish a son in that situation and force him to deal with consequences that may really ruin his life and put him in an even worse situation. Even if he was to marry that girl and provide for that child, we don't want to make that girl and that child pay the consequences, because they're going to be affected by our son's ability to provide for them. So you see, these issues are more complicated, and for us parents, we have to look at that whole situation and ask ourselves, if it's our son involved, what's the best outcome for our son? What's the best outcome for that child? What's the best outcome for that girl? And we have to seek to do what's best for all of those who are involved. And remember, too, this is an opportunity for us to evangelize that girl. This is an opportunity for us in the future to evangelize that child when that child grows up and learns what the circumstances were in which he was born and how grandma and grandpa helped, and so on. So if it's our son, we've got to think, what's the best situation? What's the best solution for everyone? What's done is done. And I'm not saying we should have a careless attitude about this, but what's done is done as far as our response is concerned. And we have to make the best of it. If it's our daughter, well, then things get even more difficult, because there's no way for us to constrain that boy, especially if he's an immoral boy. Obviously, he's already immoral to some degree because we're involved in this situation in the first place. But if he's a really careless, immoral young man, he's going to try to split on this. And so we've got to try to find the best solution to that situation. We may end up with a single mother for the rest of her life. And we may have to learn how to deal with that situation. Many of us have sisters who got themselves into those troubles and have had to live with the consequences and already know what that's like. I've experienced that with my sister, one of my sisters. So I know what that's like. I've seen that life and what the consequences are. And as a family member, as much as you can be frustrated and annoyed, you have to look at it and say, okay, well, what's done is done. What's the best thing that I can do to try to help? To consider the children, consider the daughter or the sister involved, and respond in the best way possible. So as long as we have that frame of mind, I don't think that evils will come out of these situations, because I think that our goodness can overcome these evils. And again, we have an opportunity to bear witness to the power of God's grace, the reality of that grace in our lives. We have an opportunity to change relationships forever for the good. And we need to make sure we take advantage of those opportunities and make good use of them, because there are going to be moments that change our family forever, and we're going to determine whether those moments change our family for good or for evil. And doing this, what it always comes back to, it's the story of the prodigal son is so helpful because it shows us this. And we see the father and his response, and we see the outcome, and we're told this is what God is like. And so these opportunities for us, as painful as they are, as difficult as they are, they give us an opportunity not only to imitate God and be like God in dealing with others, but they also give us a very unique and powerful opportunity to feel God's love in our own life, and to realize that as much as you might be angry and might complain about what this son or this daughter has done and what it requires from you to deal with it in the best way possible, that's what God has done again and again for you. And that's ultimately what determines how we respond, and it's how we go through these experiences and come out of them loving God more than we did before. So I'm going to present that as a first talk on the topic. And I think, like I said, I think if we get our minds right as Christian parents, these difficulties are not difficult to handle as long as we're thinking like Christians. I think the biggest threat is our concern with what other people will think or say or how it will look and things like that. I don't think dealing with the problem is that big of a deal. I think it's a test of our humility. It's a shoving a hot, fiery iron into our pride and just tormenting us. But if we can get over that and care more about our children and our family than insignificant people outside, we'll be able to handle these situations rightly and do so in a way that glorifies God and may actually lead in the long term to the end that we desired. And it won't be true. It won't actually be true that what we feared has come upon us, because what we feared appeared to be coming upon us, but in fact turned out not to come upon us. And what we hoped for did in fact come to us. I hope that's helpful. God bless.